Alright, my name is Kevin, and this is me and Sophie's project on the impact of imperialism in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So just for some brief information, this is a map of the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is just southeast of Florida, and it consists of three main islands: St. Croix, St. John, and St. Thomas. So our first question is, how and why did the U.S. imperialize the U.S. Virgin Islands? And our first response is that during the early 20th century, the US became paranoid about the imperial country of Germany, who also wanted to purchase the Danish West Indies and Galapagos archipelago from Ecuador. Because of this, the US Virgin Islands thus became closely associated with the Monroe Doctrine during the first 2 decades of the 20th century. For many Americans, it seemed unquestionable that the US was the only legitimate purchaser of the islands. After many attempts to negotiate their transfer from Denmark, a deal was finally struck in 1916, and by March 31st, 1917, the U.S. Virgin Islands was now a U.S. territory. When the United States purchased them for $25 million in gold in an effort to improve military positioning during critical times of World War I, St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John became the U.S. Virgin Islands. The military and the interior departments managed the new U.S. territory until the passage of the Organic Act in 1936. Today, the U.S. Virgin Islands is a U.S. territory run by an elected governor. The territory is under the jurisdiction of the President of the United States of America, and residents are American citizens. Our third question is, what are the positive and negative long-term impacts of U.S. imperialism? My first reason is the ease of which the U.S. will be able to trade goods and services on a global level and the stabilization of the global economy, which led to unpredicted international growth. Other countries that do not own or possess items or goods from the U.S. will trade to own such items or goods. This results in a favorable situation for both trading sides, or a win-win situation. On one side, U.S. companies are receiving profit for items or goods that they sell. On the flip side, you gain items and goods that you do not possess in your country. Items and goods can range from food, guns, technology, resources, and so on. Another positive long-term effect of U.S. imperialism is U.S. citizenship. The people's addition into the United States via purchase of land from foreign governments, or though conquest, typically were granted the honor of citizenship. Isolated islands and collections of islands exampled in this world would be the U.S. Virgin Islands, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. The last positive long-term effect of U.S. imperialism is the end of slavery. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified on 6th of December 1865, proclaims that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. As an example, slavery was still in the mild use in the U.S. Virgin Islands when Denmark ruled the territory. When the United States finalized their purchase, the 13th Amendment was enforced, and the few slaves that were still in servitude were freed accordingly. Albeit slowly this process happened, it was indeed implemented. Now I have two examples of negative long-term impacts of U.S. imperialism. The first one being provocation. Provocation of the international community by the U.S. during the same time of imperialism was certainly a negative. The U.S. concerned and provoked most European, South American, and Asian countries that were within the same general area of the territory the U.S. assumed control. To the international community, it seemed the U.S. was aggressively moving towards a threshold of global dominance. My last negative long-term impact of U.S. imperialism is the fact that the U.S. government, by their own diplomatic policy presidents, technically did not have any business in maintaining control of or the purchasing of the land from foreign nations and far offshore islands. The Monroe Doctrine, which was issued on the 2nd of December 1823, would shape diplomatic policy for nearly 80 years, until President William McKinley changed that policy precedence by, ironically, citing it as part of justification for war with Spain in 1898. This change of policy had a detrimental effects to how the U.S. would be later perceived in the international community. Our last question is, what is our relationship like with the U.S. Virgin Islands? And I would say extremely well. This is because the U.S. is still in control of the islands. The U.S. government maintains a strong connection with the people and government of the U.S. Virgin Islands. The people have been granted U.S. citizenship and democratic elections for their own governor. The overall facts suggest that the U.S. has excellent relations with the U.S. Virgin Islands.
The Virgin Islands rank upon some of the world's most literate regions. They have a 98% adult literacy rate, except this wasn't always the case. The 1990 U.S. Census reported out of 55,639 residents of the Virgin Islands over the age of 25, 14,021, or 25%, held a high school diploma. 15%, or 8,421, held a bachelor's degree or higher. And the College of the Virgin Islands was founded in 1962 as a junior college. The United States granted residents of the Virgin Islands citizenship in 1927. From 1917 to 1931, the islands were under the authority of the U.S. Navy. In 1931, the U.S. Department of the Interior took administrative responsibility, with the president appointing a governor. A legislature of 15 locally elected members from the three main islands has been in place since 1954. Members are elected for 2-year terms on the Virgin Islands. Several constitutional conventions have dealt with Virgin Islands voting and legislative rights. The Organic Act of 1936, which established constitutional government for the islands, granted universal suffrage. Also, in 1936, the first political party on the islands was organized. Since the purchase of the Virgin Islands by the United States, islanders have continued to agitate for home rule. U.S. naval officers governed the Virgin Islands from 1970 until 1931, when the United States appointed Dr. Paul D. Pierson as the first civilian governor. He set up programs to invigorate the island's economy. The Virgin Islands Company was established to encourage homestead farming, revive the sugarcane industry, and improve the port of St. Thomas. But while social services improved during the first years of U.S. ownership, the Virgin Islands remained impoverished as a result of continued failures in trade and agriculture. The 1920s, which was the first full decade of U.S. ownership, were economically depressed years in the Virgin Islands. Lacking a viable economic system following the decline of plantation agriculture and trade, the islands remained impoverished. The U.S. Prohibition Act, in effect from 1919 to 1933, has been extended to the Virgin Islands and had hurt the rum production industry. Even after the appointment of a new governor in 1931, the establishment of new programs to increase economic growth, unemployment was still widespread. Culturally, Virgin Islands have developed art forms, clothing, cuisine, and traditions unique to their region and its Caribbean and African history. Economically, the Virgin Islands remain dependent on the United States. Politically, the relationship is troubled. The United States granted the islanders citizenship in 1927, but did not allow them a delegate in the U.S. Congress until 1972. The United States wanted the islands chiefly to defend access to the Panama Canal and to prevent Germans from acquiring a strategic position in the Caribbean during World War I. Their idea was that it would provide additional military enforcement by eliminating the islands from European rule. The political cartoon on the left shows imperialism because the United States is holding the different places in its hands, showing that they get to just choose which place they want. The Virgin Islands is in that deck of cards because the United States imperialized the islands for military advancement. The political cartoon on the right shows Uncle Sam looking at a map of different places the United States imperialized, and it's shown as food, because he's choosing which one he wants to get, even though he got all of them, but it was just like showing when he didn't have all of them, which one he's going to pick. And the Virgin Islands are shown as the Sandwich Islands. And the guy is serving him. The gross domestic product of the Virgin Islands in 2015 was $3.765 billion US dollars. This territory uses US currency, and the fiscal year is the 1st of October to the 30th of September. Tourism, trade, and other services are the primary economic activities, accounting for nearly 60% of the Virgin Islands' GDP and about half of total civilian employment. The literacy rate in the Virgin Islands is 90%.
Our last two questions are, what is the current U.S. interference in the U.S. Virgin Islands and the current U.S. Virgin Islands economy? Now, for the first question, the U.S. interference is minimal. In the Virgin Islands today, the U.S. conducts military exercises on or near the Virgin Islands, regularly among with generous financial aid that has prevented the islands from total economic collapse. The last question, what is the current U.S. Virgin Islands economy? Well, the economic standings of the U.S. Virgin Islands have been mixed, especially over the last 25 years. Due to a long history of bad economic policies by the local government and numerous natural disasters, the economy of the Virgin Islands has deteriorated considerably. On average, the people of the islands produce less financial capital than their American counterparts by a factored average of $20,000 US dollars. However, with all things considered, the islands are improving thanks to, in large parts, of U.S. aid and new government implementing economic policies that focus on deregulation. The largest industries on the island are tourism and rum production, accounting for approximately 31% of the GDP of the U.S. Virgin Islands.